Good evening, afternoon. Welcome to Cafe Conversations. I would just like to let you know we're getting ready to start. And so I would like to introduce our speaker this evening. Just a quick note, we know this can be a sensitive subject, but we are very interested in hearing opinions, and just please keep it respectful, and I'm sure it will be a very interesting evening. So I'm introducing Dr. Loren Lybarger, Associate Professor in Classics and World Religion. He teaches courses in Islam, theories of religion, religion and violence, Sufism, and political Islam. He is advisor for the Islamic Studies Certificate Program, so if you're interested, he is here and ready to talk afterwards. He has also published articles and books on Islamic political movements and Palestinian nationalism. He is finishing a book on religion and identity among Palestinians in Chicago. So please welcome Dr. Lybarger.
Good afternoon, everyone. Is this working? Yeah, there we go. Is that too loud? Feels loud. Okay. Welcome. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here to have this chance to engage all of you on what can be a quite controversial topic, but certainly very, very current and important, I think, for us to engage collectively. I am thinking very much about this gathering right now today among us as a conversation and not so much as a lecture or talk despite my podium here. I do have some notes. I just wanted to keep track of some things here. And I do have a PowerPoint, but I promise not to inflict too much of that on you. The talk today is titled Radical Islam between quotes and brackets, colon, what's religion got to do with it? And so I want to begin by first acknowledging that Islam once again is in the news in possibly the worst possible way with the attacks in Brussels a couple of weeks ago with now 38 dead, and in November 2015 in Paris 137 dead, once again putting the Islamic State very much in the spotlight, and once again igniting a series of very predictable debates about Islam in the world. Much of the discussion about the Islamic State bleeds very quickly over into a not very careful discussion about Islam. So oftentimes when we're talking about the Islamic State or about Islamic movements or Islamist movements, we don't make distinctions very carefully. And so much of the discussion that we have in the media among ourselves is not very differentiated, and that in my view is deeply problematic. So one of my objectives today for us is to begin to grapple with some of these distinctions, but also what I want to do is to explore this debate that we have about Islam in the modern world, in our contemporary moment, to try to move beyond our debate about the effectiveness of security measures or their ineffectiveness, about refugees and immigrants, and about whether Islam and Muslims are compatible with modernity, to move beyond that, to explore what religion generally, or how religion generally relates to modern political movements, and especially radical political mobilization in our contemporary context. And to this end, I'll be talking not only about the Islamic State, but also about another case, the Branch Davidians. And before I go any further, I want to immediately acknowledge that in the room here today, we have people who also are experts in their own ways. I first of all want to acknowledge Dr. Ziad Abu Rish from our history department, who not too long ago gave a talk on the Islamic State at Wright State University, or no, Dayton University, University of Dayton. And so Ziad, Dr. Abu Rish, I would urge you to be an active participant, to come to the mic and to take part in the conversation. Also, my colleague Bill Owens and Berkeley Franz, yes. I've been teaching a course in our difficult dialogue sequences in our Department of Classics and World Religions on the topic of what is evil, and one of the components dealt with the Branch Davidians. And so I'd be interested in having your input as well, and anybody else in the room who might be in that class, your input on this question stemming from that particular section of your course. Okay, so first of all, I do want to sort of begin now with this debate about the Islamic State and outline a couple of positions that have been taken in our media. And then I'm going to move into a sort of a clip that shows you, I'm going to show you a segment of a debate between two individuals who take up two sides of this debate. And then I want to open it up to you a little bit to talk about how you parse that debate. And then we'll go on from there. So let's get into the debate a little bit. So and this is drawing or painting in very broad brush strokes, but let me see here. Does that work? There we go. I want to talk about the first debate, or the first position in the debate, and describe it in terms of a position that argues that, again, in very broad brush strokes, that religion has everything to do with it. That is to say, everything to do with radical Islam. Radical Islam is very Islamic. And I'm taking this quote from Graham Wood's piece in the Atlantic Journal from almost a year ago that many people in the media continue to talk about. And Wood makes this statement or this claim in his article, arguing that the Islamic State is very Islamic, and argues for the necessity of taking that seriously, that Islam is central to the identity of the Islamic State. In broad terms, Wood and others who take this position with respect to the Islamic State or with respect to radicalized religious movements generally will argue that ideals and values guide and legitimize social action. So legitimacy being a really important part of this. And if we don't take, in the case of the Islamic State, if we don't take Islam seriously, if we don't see it as an important component of what the Islamic State is, that religion is very much central to its project and to its identity, then we misunderstand the movement. Part of this argument as well, as I've just put it out there, we can't understand social or political movements without examining their legitimating frameworks, and again, religion being very important to that. Graham Wood and others have argued radical Islamic movements take Islam seriously, so we must too, even if we disagree with their interpretations. Okay? So that's one side of the debate. The second position will argue that actually religion has very little, perhaps nothing, really to do with it. Radical Islam is the product of non-religious factors, okay, that are perfectly understandable. We can understand the Islamic State. How did that happen? We can understand the Islamic State by looking at these other factors. What might they include? Well, historically, we have to begin with Western imperialism and understand that Western imperialism creates the conditions for the emergence of groups like IS. And it's specifically, if we were talking about the Islamic State, then we need to be thinking or remembering the important impact of the U.S. invasion of Iraq and how that creates this very profound destabilization of Iraq and ultimately Syria, undermining these state structures profoundly. This creates the conditions for groups like the Islamic State. Others have argued that these groups are led by sociopaths who manipulate religion cynically, and so there's and that individuals joining these movements are joining them for a whole host of reasons: maladjustment in their societies. They might have their own desire to accumulate wealth or accumulate power in one form or another. There are multiple different motivations that have nothing to do with religion, psychological and material motivations. So ISIS is not, the Islamic State is not Islamic, but rather a dangerous cult like the Branch Davidians. Okay, so the language of cult is sometimes used to describe this as a way to delegitimize the movement and to delegitimize any notion that religion might have something to do with this. And then finally, sort of more sophisticated analyses will argue that a set of historical political processes that are related to the nation-state system and its contradictions and failures are are at the basis of this. I'm thinking of the arguments of somebody like a Darrell Lee, who will argue that we can't understand the Islamic State without understanding the nation-state system globally and especially regionally in the Middle East, and the specific historical developments that have led to the situation in which those states have become weakened, or in other cases where the state is, in a sense, overdetermined, overpowering, and therefore brittle as well. In that sense, then, too, somebody like a Darrell Lee will argue that we have to look to political factors, and religion is really, in a sense, almost secondary. Darrell Lee does, for example, say that it's important, but he never really gets around to explaining why that's so. He is much more focused on trying to understand the specific shape and form of the Islamic State in relationship to what's happening in Syria and Iraq. But again, making the argument that we can understand a movement like this perfectly well without having to really focus on religion in any sort of substantial way as part of the explanation. Okay, so I kind of want to show you a clip here. I do want to show you a clip here of this debate in action featuring Graham Wood and Mehdi Hassan, who responded to Graham Wood in an article titled "How Islamic is the Islamic State?" And then they debated one another on Al Jazeera, on a talk show hosted by or on Al Jazeera. So I want to play that clip. Oh, where do I put that? Okay. And as you're watching, I would like you to sort of take notes or think about what is at stake in this debate and what you sort of maybe also what side you might take in it, what you think of it.
Welcome to Roadmap, everyone. It has become one of the most debated questions in recent months. Is the Islamic State actually Islamic at all? Its leaders, supporters, and fighters will tell you they are practicing the true and only version and vision for Islam, and those who do not subscribe to their vision are simply not Muslims. Others say the perversion of the religion has no basis in Islam, and the cherry-picking of selective texts are nothing more than tools to manipulate people into joining what some have called a death cult. Today, we want to discuss that question and much more. Is it fair to say or even consider that the Islamic State has its roots in the religion or not? To discuss this, I'm joined now by Graham Wood, a contributing editor for The Atlantic and author of this month's cover story, What ISIS Really Wants. And in D.C., we're joined by Mehdi Hassan, a presenter on Al Jazeera English and a contributor to the New Statesman magazine. Mehdi penned a rebuttal to Graham's piece titled, How Islamic is the Islamic State? Not at all. Welcome to you both. Thank you very much for joining us. I wanted to start off by giving you both a chance. Graham first, if you can tell us the central thesis of your piece. What is it that you concluded from your research in journalism?
My conclusion is certainly that the Islamic State is Islamic. It is rejected by nearly all Muslims. It has an interpretation that I would actually agree is a fringe interpretation and is a death cult. But the seriousness of the Islamic State in its selective readings of text, but it's the concern that it has when it looks to texts is actually something that puts it within an Islamic tradition.
Great. And Mehdi, let me give you a chance as well. If you can give us the central thesis to your piece about why the Islamic State is not Islamic at all.
I think that most of the experts who have looked at ISIS and whether these are intelligence analysts, whether these are academic specialist think tanks, they suggest that religion is not the motivating factor here, it's what comes later. What motivates these guys tends to be a search for identity, for purpose, for a sense of adventure, a sense of belonging. And where I differ with Graham is I think, I don't take as gospel the word of, people who behead aid workers and rape young girls. I think we should be a little bit more skeptical about their claims to being religious or holy warriors.
But Mehdi, let me put this back at you, which is the motivation to become a radical or extremist is different than the fact ISIS actually uses and cherry picks certain excerpts from the Quran to manipulate people. Are we talking about two different things? Are you talking more about the radicalization process and rather than what ISIS uses to justify its actions?
Eamon, it's a very good question. It is two different things. There is one issue with what motivates these guys, this big question. Why are young men and women leaving London or Berlin or New York or wherever to go and fight for ISIS? And again, religion is not the factor. You talk to people from the CIA, the FBI, Britain's MI5. There are other factors at play. In fact, if you're the more religious you are, the less likely you are to be radicalized, according to Britain's own MI5. But on your point about cherry picking, you're right, and I think Graham agrees as well that it is a fringe interpretation. The problem is, in Graham's Atlantic piece, he talks about ISIS being not just Islamic, but, quote, very Islamic. He says they derive from, quote, coherent and even learned interpretations of Islam. And I'm sorry, that's just nonsense, because why can't we find any learned Islamic scholars or imams in the Islamic world who endorse ISIS? Al-Azhar University, Eamon, the most prestigious seat of learning in Sunni Islam, says ISIS follows a false Islam. The Grand Mufti of Saudi Arabia, who you might think would be a little bit sympathetic to ISIS, given their common Salafist heritage, he says ISIS is the #1 enemy of Islam. And the problem here is they call themselves Islamic. They tell Western journalists we're very serious about our faith. And we kind of believe them and start doing their PR for them, which I think is a mistake. North Korea calls itself the Democratic People's Republic of North Korea. We don't consider them to be democratic.
Thanks for that point, Mahdi. So Graham, let me give you a chance to discuss that point. You do say that they are very Islamic, yet as Mahdi was saying, they've been rejected by everybody, and many say that the very fact that they just cherry pick certain excerpts of the religion and not the whole religious teachings of it undermines the fact that they can be Islamic.
Right. So there's certainly discussion within Islam of what the correct interpretation of Islam is, and Muslim scholars have overwhelmingly said that the Islamic State's interpretation is the wrong one. But to say that they're serious, to say that they're coherent, is a question that we can judge by looking at the statements that they themselves make. And it doesn't mean that we have to agree with them. Almost all Muslims do not. But they do have a council of scholars. This council of scholars has its own strange, fringe interpretations. And they are looking at Islamic texts, and they're doing it in a scholarly way. It's a way that, as I say, is rejected. But this council of scholars, it mass produces fatwas, and these can be read, these can be rejected, they can be analyzed in an intellectual way. They're not being produced, though, by people who are making things up.
I know that you spent a lot of time, Mahdi, we'll come back to it in just a second. I know you spent a lot of time about, for this piece, interviewing particularly members or others around ISIS and that ideology. Did you get a sense, though, that these people were fully aware of the religious aspect, or were they kind of aloof, motivated by other things? I mean, we've heard all these excerpts that these guys are like buying Islam for Dummies from bookstores before they get on a plane and travel overseas to learn about their religion. What did you get a sense about their convictions and their own understanding of the religion?
First of all, their convictions consist of a rejection of almost all Muslim scholarship that has happened, not just in the current day, but for the last thousand years. So their concern, though, was deeply religious. They were looking at particular texts, and they cared about these things. It doesn't mean that they didn't come to these positions because of political grievances or because of certain kinds of alienation, but they were looking at these things as fringe scholars. They were looking at them perhaps the way that the Branch Davidians might have looked at Christian texts, in a way that's rejected by mainstream Christianity, and in this case, mainstream Islam. But that's nonetheless quite serious.
Mahdi, you wanted to jump in on a previous point that was being made.
Just on those couple of points that Graham made. Yeah. I mean, I'm not sure how you can call ISIS scholarly, given, as Graham concedes, and as we all know, all of Islam scholars, whether conservative or liberal, Sufi or Salafi, Sunni or Shia, reject ISIS and ISIS's so-called methods and so-called fatwa. So I'm not sure how you can actually sustain that argument that they are scholarly if the scholars reject them. Just very quickly on the Branch Davidian point, Graham is absolutely right. They are very similar to the Branch Davidians, and no serious person would call the Branch Davidians, quote, very Christian.
Okay. So I kind of want to pick up the discussion here by maybe actually making it a discussion and turning it over to you. If I can bring this up here. Yeah. And ask you, how would you characterize the underlying issues in this debate? Whom do you think is right? What's at stake? And sort of prime our pump a little bit, I want you to turn to people who are sitting around you, maybe 2 or 3 people sitting near you, and begin to talk about that among yourselves for maybe a couple of minutes, literally 2 minutes maybe. And then we can, I'll solicit some contributions from the floor at that point. So go ahead and turn to people around you, and let's talk among yourselves about what you've just seen using these questions. There we go. So let's get some responses from around the room, and I'm going to start with you guys. You had, want to come up to the mic and maybe.
So I just say my.
Yeah.
Okay. I thought that the second argument was stronger in that ISIS is not, that the Islamic, radical Islam is not related to, is less, okay, I'll get there, is not connected to the Islamic religion just because they say they are, and that I think it speaks toward kind of our, or the general Western lack of understanding when just because somebody says they're Islamic, we say, yeah, of course you are. So I thought the second argument was stronger.
Okay, so one of the issues that comes up here, and I think in your group too, you talked about the comparison to the Branch Davidians, right? Why would one call the Branch Davidians Christian, right? And comparing that to the Islamic State, why, if most Muslims reject the Islamic State as legitimately representative of Islam, and that's true, most Muslims do. I mean, just one, I can cite one example after another of major institutions and scholars and representatives of organizations, individuals making very public statements about the rejection of the claims of the Islamic State to represent Islam. And similarly, there was a similar kind of reaction to the Branch Davidians after the Waco events in 1993. And so it raises a question of where do, this normative question, right, is in play here in this discussion of, what is Islam? Who gets to, or Christianity, or Judaism, or any religion, who gets to decide that question, right? That's, I think, one of the fundamental issues at play here. And it gets wrapped up in this media discussion, and it interestingly gets picked up by political leaders. Barack Obama, President Obama himself, has weighed in and said, declared that the Islamic State is not Islamic, right? There's a desire here to delegitimize the movement, right? To deny its credentials as representative in any way of Islam, okay, in normative terms. And similarly, I think, after Baruch Goldstein walked into a mosque in Hebron and opened fire on Palestinian Muslim worshipers in the Ibrahimi Mosque, slaughtering them as they prayed during Ramadan, there was a desire on the part of Jews globally to renounce that action as not representative in any way of Judaism, even though Baruch Goldstein identified quite strongly with Judaism. And the groups that he was connected to very much argued that this was an expression of what Judaism required and demanded, okay? Similarly, with the Branch Davidians, right? There was a rejection of the Branch Davidians as radical, as a cult, and again, the word cult is mobilized in these contexts as a way to argue that this movement has nothing to do with Christianity, properly understood, okay? So this question of what is Islam, what is Christianity, what is Judaism, we can go down the line with multiple other examples of other religions, comes into play, and the question of who gets to decide that question, okay? What else? Some other reactions in the room. You got to speak up since you don't have a mic, or you can come up here too.
I'll speak up. I think that there's an important, talking about religion, there's an important personal aspect at play. Like, someone has a set of beliefs. Like, who am I to say, well, who am I to define what it is? And there's a personal thing there. However, when we're talking groups of people, sometimes it's better to step out. And if you had to look at it, like, statistically, and look at the, over 1 billion Muslims on the planet, the majority are pointing at this group and saying, no, they're not really with us, like, they're not on the same page as us. That interpretation is probably more important because we can't really get through the personal aspect of it.
Okay.
Can you repeat a little bit so everybody can hear?
So again, I think re-emphasizing here that in this case, on this question of on the question of whether the Islamic State is really very Islamic or Islamic at all, one goes with the majority here, and so we would argue that this Islam has nothing to do with this movement. It isn't representative of Islam. Okay. Other responses?
I can tell with the or whether the people in the Islamic State feel like they are Muslim.
Ah, okay.
The second person,
Uh-huh.
he was arguing about the Islamic State in itself not being Islamic. And I think I almost feel like there were two different debates, or a reworded debate would have had a better impact when we're talking about this. Because I feel like the first person was writing, and I feel, and maybe he even had like a really great article with good insights, but was he talking about the people in the Islamic State feeling like if they are true Muslims or not? And that's a different debate from us identifying the Islamic State as Islamic.
Okay, so to recap, the comment here is identifying or saying, I think you were saying that it's almost as if there are two conversations going on in that debate, and they're talking past one another, okay? Graham Wood, and this was on MSNBC, by the way, I wanted to note that, not on Al Jazeera. Mahdi Hassan is connected with Al Jazeera, so that was my confusion. Graham Wood was making the argument that we have, in a sense, to take the Islamic State at its word, right? And they claim to be Muslims. Their leaders, many of them have degrees in Islamic studies. Al-Baghdadi apparently supposedly has a doctorate in Islamic studies. He has a doctorate in Islamic studies. They have a council of scholars. He was talking about this, right? Obviously, Islam is important to them, right? And so he's interested in that question, whereas Mahdi Hassan is responding to, or arguing, in a sense, or having a different conversation and wanting to say, we can't talk about this movement as Islamic. They aren't Islamic at all. And in fact, when we really look at the movement, we see that there are so many other factors involved with what motivates people to join the movement. Their interests and goals are very much this worldly interests and goals. They're not really interested in religion. It's a secondary justification sort of slapped on to what is really a phenomenon that's about something else, right? So two different conversations talking past one another. Did anybody else have that sense, or was that part of your conversation among yourselves? No? Okay. Okay, so you would agree with Mahdi Hassan, it's all political, and they're cynically cherry-picking bits and pieces of the Islamic tradition to sort of propagandize and justify their actions. But otherwise, it's very cynical, and it's all about politics. Yeah, okay.
Lauren, is it possible that people can agree that what they're doing isn't consistent with the principles of Islam, and yet, because there is some basis in religion, although it's fringe, that perhaps we can learn lessons by trying to understand what elements of the religion they are cherry picking,
Mm-hmm.
and so therefore we can understand this fringe group better by looking at the religion, but understanding that it's not representative of the majority of people who practice this religion.
Right. So Roxanne, you're picking up on the comment over here. I think that's a tension here in this debate. And the problem is that in Graham Wood in his article makes these very provocative statements that cause what I think is his argument that we need, in a sort of a value-neutral sort of way, that is to say, without presuming to decide the question of what is and is not Islam, we need to try to understand the Islamic State on its own terms. This is what they're putting out there. They're obviously very concerned about justifying their actions, interpreting, expressing, or framing their actions in these religious Islamic terms. They have, as I said, a council of scholars that produce fatwas or religious declarations to explain their actions. So they're very concerned about this, justifying their actions in these terms. So we need to understand that, right, if we're going to understand this movement. Graham Wood, I think, wants to argue that. I think that's the core of his article. But then he has these statements in there, and I think it's meant to be provocative, where he says, you know, the Islamic State is not just Islamic, it's very Islamic. And then he quotes Bernard Heikel, a scholar at Princeton, who basically dismisses anybody who would have an Iranic peaceful interpretation of Islam as having a kind of cotton-candied view of the Islamic tradition. So another sort of very sort of provocative, polemical statement in there meant to sort of provoke a reaction, right? I mean, this is, in a sense, the media being very cynical in attempting to, you know, provoke discussion and get clicks through on the article. So I think there's a problem within Graham Wood's article itself, where it's not clear sometimes, right, whether he is, you know, deigning to enter into this normative debate and make pronouncements about what is and what is not really Islamic. Or is he trying to take a strictly value-neutral approach here and putting out the question about how does this movement understand itself in subjective terms? Yeah. This gentleman and then you.
Well, in the tradition of religion, how fringe is jihad? I mean, isn't that important here? I mean, is it really a fringe kind of part of the Quran, or is it a more substantial part? The whole idea of when you undertake jihad and those kind of.
Well, that's a really complex question. I mean, jihad is mentioned in the Quran. So the question is how fringe is the concept of jihad in Islam? And I guess maybe, are you implying then that the Islamic State, if jihad is a central component of Islam, then the Islamic State in raising or connecting or invoking this idea isn't necessarily, or may not necessarily be so fringe after all?
Well, it depends how central the whole concept is to passages in the Quran.
Good. So I think the argument here then is that if the Islamic State is invoking ideas and concepts that are actually central to the Islamic religious tradition, on what basis then do you dismiss the movement as not Islamic? And I think that's partly what Graham Wood was arguing in his essay, was that in fact the Islamic State is drawing on central components of the tradition. Even though in the debate here he says they are, you know, clearly taking fringe positions. Most Muslims reject the Islamic State, right? But yes, the jihad is mentioned in the Quran. It is an important area of discussion in jurisprudential discussions. But it's a much more complicated concept, and it's debated. And so, for instance, just before coming here, I was reading a long discussion about the way in which the medieval Islamic scholars worked out a very elaborate set of conditions about that limited warfare. It was a discussion that is very similar to the discussion about just war in Catholic thinking. So the medieval scholars were very concerned about, for example, limiting violence to combatants, limiting the kind of violence that you could inflict on, not just on preventing violence against non-combatants, but also not destroying people's livelihoods, for example. That there were very strict criteria for when you launched a war. Or fought. And so there was a real attempt in the medieval tradition, for example, to place limits on warfare in a way similar to the just war tradition in Christianity. Just as an example right there, okay, so that jihad then is central, is a central area of discussion within the Islamic religious tradition, but it is debated, and there are multiple different perspectives that have been worked out on this question. It's ambiguous because the Prophet himself, to whom Muslims look as an example, was not only a prophet, a message bringer of a divine revelation, but he was also a statesman. He founded a political entity. He was a religious leader, providing religious guidance to his followers. But he was also a military commander. And so in his own example, right, you have a very complicated exemplar of what it means to be a Muslim, right? And violence is a part of that. Warfare is a part of that. And so when the Islamic State invokes the Prophet's example, or the example of Muslim generals and how they treated prisoners, or digs up parts of the tradition that Muslims don't really pay attention to anymore or consider to be fringe, right? I mean, that stuff is there in the tradition, very much in the way that it's also there in the Bible, right? I mean, you can go to the Bible, you can find passages about stoning adulteresses, or carrying out genocidal violence in the book of Joshua, for example. It's all there, right? And therefore retrieval by different groups, and so in that sense, one would have to agree perhaps with Graham Wood that in terms of their own subjective understanding as a movement, the Islamic State is drawing on components of the tradition. Whether or not Muslims accept that is another question, right? But in trying to understand the movement, he wants to argue that it's important to see that this is in fact what they're doing, and they're very, concerned to make arguments based on that tradition. Okay, so these dueling positions, right? Oftentimes boil down to accusations of Islamophobia and racism on the part of anybody who would argue that, say for example, that the Islamic State represents any part of Islam. There's a real sensitivity on the part of Muslims, understandably, given the history of Orientalism in the West, of colonialism, and the way in which historically, going all the way back to the first encounters between Christianity and Islam, the Prophet has been portrayed, Muhammad has been portrayed as a violent, bloodthirsty individual. This is an old theme in the history of the encounter of the so-called West with Islam. And so when Muslims hear this, they hear all of that coming back, okay? And there's an understandable sensitivity around this. And understandably, a desire to say, to point to other things, and especially to point to colonialism, right? And there's real importance to that, right? I mean, just as I would argue, in some ways I'm going to sort of lay my cards out on the table here. I think that we cannot dismiss everything that Graham Wood is saying here. I think, speaking as a sociologist, I would argue that it is absolutely necessary to understand the subjective orientations of individuals and groups. If we're going to understand, what it is that orients people in the way in their social actions. But at the same time, we cannot ignore context and historical specificities. And clearly, with regard to the Islamic State, we cannot ignore colonialism. We cannot ignore the U.S. invasion of Iraq and so on. Those who argue against that position will argue that if you are saying that Islam really has nothing to do with this, you're simply engaging in apologetics and do not want to subject Islam to criticism. Again, I think these are positions that we find ourselves trapped in, and I would like to argue about trying to move to a more sort of, if at all possible, to open up sort of some space, right, where we can have a more analytical discussion. But I'll get to that in a few more minutes. I want to point out here also what I think might be going on in this discussion, in this debate, and that has to do with kind of a post-Enlightenment secular bias against talking about religion. There's a presumption, I think, especially among academics, that religion is superstructural or epiphenomenal, that it comes later, or it comes after other more sort of harder, more material factors. I mean, this came up here with this whole discussion about how the Islamic State, the debate about the Branch Davidians also, that it wasn't really about religion, it was really about David Koresh and his psychopathic pathology. So there was a kind of psychoanalyzing of it. In the case of the Islamic State, there's an argument here that it's all about politics and political interests or material interests, not really about religion. Religion is a kind of false consciousness or an illusion. All of this is sort of hardwired into post-Enlightenment understandings of religion, and I think really powerfully informs a lot of the discussion, especially on the side of the debate that wants to dismiss religion or to de-emphasize it as a factor. So I want to step back a little bit here and ask a very basic question. I've been using the word religion quite frequently, but we haven't really asked the question, what is religion? So let's take another 2 more minutes here, and I want you to just talk with somebody sitting next to you about what religion is. What is religion in your view? Okay. Real quick show of hands. How many of you said that religion is belief? Hold your hands up high. I want to see. How many of you say that religion is belief? Okay. How many of you said that religion is practice? Smaller group of hands. Okay. All right. Want to hear from the floor. What one or two of you, a couple of groups here, what your discussion was like? Okay. Okay. What's interesting about Nigeria, I think, maybe, is that there you have the relationship or connection between religion and community identity or collective identities, right? That so identity might be a part of this equation in some way. Yeah.
Some people believe that fact is a part of faith. So I
So belief, individual personal belief. Yeah, yeah. Anything else? Anybody else? You guys again?
We talked about religion as a comfort or body that kind of brings people together and gives them a reason to.
Okay. So religion provides comfort, and what is the basis of that comfort?
That was actually Emily's idea, so
I was saying comfort as in for like comfort in like falling asleep at night, knowing that there's like a greater purpose for them, like they understand why they're here,
Okay.
and, like where they're going, like when they die.
So religion as meaning, right? Providing a structure of meaning. Okay. Under what conditions do you think religions really become important to people?
I think they become important when
When things
things start to go wrong.
start to go wrong.
It's really easy to have a lot of faith or a strong belief in God or whichever deity you worship when things are going great for you. It makes sense that there would be some loving presence, but it becomes really important when life is difficult, and that's where people lose their faith.
Okay.
Find it the strongest.
Okay.
I think when religion is also a collective action. So religion is not always about the individual. So especially in the case of Islam, sometimes it's not sufficient just to rely on belief, because in order to practice several Islamic rituals, it has to be formed in a collective action. It's like use congregational Friday prayer.
Okay.
Or maybe Hajj. It's supposed to be a collective action in part of the religion.
Okay, so religions have something to do with shaping a social world, right? Making demands, moral, ethical demands, requiring individuals and groups to perform certain duties, right? And oftentimes with the understanding that if those duties are not performed, then things won't go well in the world, right? Conversely, that if things are not going well in the world, I forget who was bringing that up back here, I think, that the performance of those duties or a return to those duties, right, will, in a sense, correct things, right? But the sense then that when things are out of balance, when things are not going well, when the world is falling apart, there then is a kind of sense of crisis, and the world is being out of kilter, right? And so then religions, will one argument that will be made within a religious context, right, is then that one reason for this suffering that is being experienced has to do with the failure to maintain, perform the required requisite duties, right? So the comfort, right, that you speak of, that religion provides in terms of a context of meaning, that things are right with the world, that many people can experience the world as one in which meaning has broken down, and one in which there, a world of suffering, right? So how then do you explain that? And if religion is a part of sort of the cultural equipment that you have access to, right? That is a part of the social environment in which one lives and one has been brought up in, it, in a sense, can become a resource for addressing. In fact, and then groups and individuals might mobilize that resource, right, and begin to put that out into the public space, and as part of, in that sense, it starts to become political. Religion becomes political at that point because it is now engaging a wider audience, and an argument is being put out there that in order for us to correct our situation of suffering, we need to return back to these practices. We've lost sight of them, and our world has fallen apart because of that. Okay. How are we doing on time, by the way? Okay. I'm going to skip the rest of my my PowerPoint, and let me put this out to you right now. The way that I think about religion is in this way. Religion is a set of cultural practices. It is something that we have encountered globally and transhistorically. And if we want to understand what religion is, we need to understand it in terms of a very particular set of practices that have to do with communicating, presuming the existence of superhuman powers and the capacity to communicate with them, okay? These powers are believed, and I would argue that this is the case in every sort of religion, in every religious context that we might encounter, that these powers are believed to address suffering in the realm of the body, of society, and of nature. So that when I'm glad that we have moved into this discussion of suffering, because I think in contexts where the social world and the political world is fracturing and fragmenting, the promises of religion start to become potentially attractive, potentially convincing. Okay. Now this is the case, in many different contexts, and so I want to leave you also with a plea, although we didn't get there. It has more to do with my failure to organize this as well as I wanted to, but to leave you with a plea in thinking about the Islamic State or the Branch Davidians, to maybe step back from the discussion about whether or not these movements are really truly Islamic or not, or Christian or not, or Baruch Goldstein, whether or not he was a real, true representative of Judaism or not, but to step back and try to understand the contexts within which these individuals and groups and movements emerge, and also to think comparatively across different cases so that we can begin to see how and why religion starts to become relevant politically in our contemporary world. Religion is not going anywhere. Clearly, it is not simply about individualized belief. Religion has immense collective resonance and relevance today, and it is linked, I would argue, very much with problems that have emerged precisely from modernity, and especially in the social and political context from the modern state itself, creating new experiences of a crisis, and in a sense, leading to new kinds of religious responses. So the human experience of suffering, of vulnerability in the political realm, in our current contemporary moment, in my view, ensures that religion will continue to be relevant as it begins to address our experiences of vulnerability in new and often quite powerful ways. So view the Islamic State as one example of this phenomenon, but be alive to other examples globally and start to think comparatively across these cases. I wish I had gotten there with you in my presentation. That's where I was headed. But I'm going to leave you with that plea. And if you have any further questions, I'd be happy to take them either now or at some point in the future. Thank you very much.